And I'm going to live stream right now. Nope, I do not want to live stream this on the criminal justice page. I love Facebook and Zoom, don't you guys all? Also, while we're getting this set up, if you have Facebook open while we're doing this, don't be alarmed if there's a little delay. There's like a 2.5 second delay for it.
All right, so who has their café con leche? I was able to make some before. So. All right. Thank you for joining us here today. We're going to get started with our Latinx Heritage
month live stream from Edinboro University. Thank you for everyone who is joining us either on this Zoom platform or on our Facebook live stream. This will be housed on our Facebook page, so if you want to watch afterwards or if you missed the live stream, you can go back and watch it. Afterwards, this will also be posted to our YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/EdinboroU. I'm going to do a couple introductions before we get started with our speakers. I'm going to introduce the individuals from Edinboro University and our friends from Slippery Rock University who are joining us today. First off is our moderator. Her name is Julianna Rios. She is the Slippery Rock University Student Organization of Latinos, Hispanic Allies, or SOL. Our coordinators today are Dr. Stephanie Diez-Morel, who I will turn it over to in a little bit after introductions. We also have Dr. Terrence Mitchell from the Edinboro University Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who's going to be joining us soon. Our panelists for today, Dr. Diez-Morel from the Social Work Department here at Edinboro. We have Dr. Sheila Lorenzo de la Pena from Edinboro's Art Therapy Department. We have Dr. Leslie C. Sotomayor from the Art Department here at Edinboro. We have social work, the Masters of Social Work student, Tatyana Abreu. Brandon Torres is the Latinx Student Organization President here at Edinboro University. We have Dr. Ana Maria Caula from Slippery Rock. She is in the Modern Languages Department. And I think we're ready to go. If I have missed anybody, I'm sure Dr. Diez-Morel can step up and mention their names. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. You will learn quite soon why this event was called the Café con Leche panel, and we are going to dig into our Latinx Cultura discussion. So I will turn it over to Dr. Diez-Morel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. You got everyone in the introduction. So I'm going to share my screen here. And so before we get started, just wanted to begin by explaining a bit about why we have a panel discussion that we named Café con Leche. So in Latinx culture, having a Café con Leche is a tradition that includes more than just enjoying a cup of coffee. It can really be a way of life in some Latinx households. And it's very common to sit around the table at family gatherings to drink and enjoy for hours in conversation. Saying to someone, let's have a café con leche, you're inviting them into your home. You're inviting them into your life. You're sharing a moment in time with them and practicing hospitality and having a deeper connection through conversation. So as the coffee warms you up and makes you feel at ease, it also allows for an opportunity to share an honesty and meaningful conversation with others. So often over a café con leche, family, friends, and friends who become family discuss their daily lives. They share what they're struggling with, and even practice being brave and vulnerable with one another by sharing in the joys and struggles that life can bring. So here's a little visual of a café con leche. So for you all to virtually join us with one. And now that I've explained a bit about why the Café con Leche title, before moving on, I would like to first acknowledge, as we are celebrating Latinx Heritage Month, I'd like to acknowledge that there are many activists in our history in the US who have advocated, struggled, and fought for us as Black and Brown folks to be allowed in an academic space, as historically we were not. And it's thanks to their efforts that we're all gathered here today to discuss Latinx Cultura. And as we're sharing this collective virtual space, I also ask that we make it a brave space. So some of you may be familiar with the term safe space, which in my discipline of social work, it's a term that was derived from a trauma-informed approach of trying to create a space where individuals who their lived experiences may create trauma reactions or responses when talking about certain topics. So a safe space is meant to be a space in which you can safely discuss topics surrounding diversity, social justice, and other topics that can be considered as controversial. And this notion of a safe space is to help calm anxieties that are often associated with discussing topics that within society or our workplaces, and even in some of our homes, are topics that we normally shy away from. However, as we're engaging in discussion today, which can be personal, and we're being vulnerable by being open and honest to be able to learn from one another and grow together, then it's a possibility that something you hear or learn today might make you feel uncomfortable. So as I always say, when one is growing, there are growing pains, and I really like to use this figure, this image, whenever I'm talking about growth and learning with students and others. We can really expect personal growth to feel uncomfortable, right? We might start in this comfort zone, go through the fear zone, into the learning zone, and now we're in the growth zone. So rather than a safe space, I would like to invite everyone to join me today in a brave space for our discussion. And in the context of a brave space, according to research, diversity, social justice, and other issues are discussed with full and equitable participation of people from all social identity groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. So with that being said, some guidelines to help facilitate this brave space communication include welcoming multiple viewpoints, using I statements, right? We're speaking directly from our own experiences. Own your intentions and impact. So respect each other's experiences and feelings by taking responsibility for the effect of your words. To work to recognize your privileges. So honoring the different experiences that we all bring to this collective space. We can take risks, right? Lean into discomfort. We're all in process, we're growing together. Challenge yourself to contribute, even if what you have to say isn't perfectly formulated. You can step back, so allow to share the space and speaking time with others. To actively listen. So use your energy to listen to what is said before thinking about how to respond, and notice if any defensiveness or denials arise. Challenge with care. So find ways to respectfully challenge others and be open to challenges. And confidentiality. So share the message, not the messenger. All right, I love this picture, right? This is a little bit of what we're going to be seeing soon when the fall foliage is in full bloom. So lastly, I would just like to acknowledge you, everyone that's here today, for taking the time to attend today's event, for engaging in this discussion, and for being willing to learn during a time in which our lives and routines have shifted in an ever-changing pandemic world. And so much occurs in our lives and the lives of others who we share this journey of life with every single day. The impact it has on each of you and your loved ones varies, and yet we are all collectively navigating through these many challenges. Thus, I invite you to take a moment to acknowledge your effort in being here today, in seeking to learn, and in striving for more. If you feel that it's helpful to you, take a breath, and exhale, and then ground yourself to this day, to this moment, and to being present. Thank you. I will now hand it over to our moderator, Julianna.
Hello, my name is Julianna Rios, and as I was introduced, I'm the president of the student organization of Latinos, Hispanics, and Allies at Slippery Rock University. And so to get the conversation started a little bit, I'm just curious, just want to learn a little bit more about your Latinx heritage, a family or friend or custom that you enjoy, your favorite dish, or anything else that your familia or cultura that you'd like to share. So I just want to open that discussion.
Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes. I'll start by sharing a little bit about my background. So I was born in New Jersey, and my parents, my mother's from Santiago de Cuba, Cuba, and my father is from Ajuntas, Puerto Rico. And they've been in the United States for many, many years, my mother since 1969, and my father at the young age of 13, so since 1963, and on the mainland. Puerto Rico is U.S. territory, and I grew up speaking Spanish as my first native tongue, and being forced into learning English in elementary school, about first grade. And my experiences my whole life have been hyphenated as a border crosser between my Spanish, Hispanic, and Latinx culture, growing up in my traditions, in my language, in my context of family and friends and social gatherings and community spaces. And I'm very happy to be a part of this panel this morning, or this afternoon, with our Café con Leche.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Does anybody else, would they like to share about their Latinx heritage or their culture?
Sure. I would love to share a little bit about my background and my heritage. My name is Ana Maria Caula, as I was introduced in the beginning. My parents are from Argentina, Buenos Aires, both of them, but I was born in Caracas, Venezuela. So I grew up already in a bicultural environment since I was very little, because in my house we used to have all the costumes, the food, the traditions of Argentina, but I grew up in a Caribbean country, in Caracas. So my sisters and I are more Caribbean in our culture, but all of that was mixed since we were little at home. And then I moved to the United States. That make it hard for me, because being little, sometimes you don't want to be different. And when I was growing up, it was a little bit of a struggle sometimes not to feel 100% Venezuelan. But after I moved to the United States and I started traveling and everything, my grandmother was from Spain too, and I started traveling, became older, and I started seeing all that as something positive, that wherever I go, I can see, many places that I go, I can see a little part of my heritage there. I can see, when I went to Spain, I could see my grandmother there, all the ladies that were having coffee in the pastry shop. Or when I went to Argentina, I could remember how we used to do asados on the weekend in my house, even though my neighbor didn't do it. Or when I eat arepas here, the day I feel sad and I come home, like we had a bad day, the first thing I do is cook arepas, because that comfort me, made me feel better. So I think I'm a little bit of all of that. Plus my daughter was born here. I've been in the United States for 27 years. And I think that made me attached to this country too. So I'm a little bit of all of those places.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the diversity that you have, that you get to express everywhere you go, is absolutely amazing. Is there anybody else that would like to express or share anything about their family or cultura?
Do you mind if I go? Okay.
Go ahead.
I was born in Guinness, Cuba, and my parents immigrated here with myself and my sister in 1990, just before Andrew, because why not? So I got to experience that. Growing up in Miami, Spanish was the only language spoken in the home for many, many, many years. I think most of the time I lived at home was just Spanish at home. And now it's both at my parents' home and at my home here, the predominant language is pretty much Spanglish, which is a very fluid and kind of casual shift and inclusion of both English and Spanish. So in case y'all aren't familiar with Spanglish, an example would be like lonchar, or, you got to go to Walmart and then you park your car in the parqueo, or you got to parquear. And then also, a favorite food would be something like barbecue, where you say BBQ. So there's different like Spanglishisms that I don't know if they're, common knowledge outside of Miami, but it's just the way of life down there. And I'm a new transplant into PA as of last summer. And it's been a little bit interesting, but we're still trying to keep up with, the Spanish at home, because I have 2 little girls, and I really, really want them to, be in touch with their culture and the language of my language and my parents and their whole families.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. It kind of gives you perspective of just how diverse the United States is, and different areas express different things. So if anybody else would like to share, they can. If not, can I move on to the next item of discussion?
I'd like to share.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so as of course I already spoke plenty, so everyone knows my name is Stephanie Diez-Morel. I am a first-generation American Argentine. So my parents immigrated from Argentina to Miami, and with my 2 older siblings, and I was the first and only one born here in the United States. Growing up in Miami, we spoke Spanish in the home, but Spanish was also kind of a language that you heard everywhere. And I remember we had very strict rules at the dinner table, where my father, who did speak English and Spanish, would always act as if he didn't speak English, because he wanted us to practice Spanish at the dinner table. And also our table manners. He was very strict on those 2 things. And it was a point of contention at times. One of my sisters would often not want to speak in Spanish, and he would just act like he didn't know, and it was very funny. So those are my experiences. And of course, growing up in Miami, it's a huge melting pot of cultures. So I didn't know really what to expect when I was a teenager and started traveling a bit more outside of Miami, of how the rest of the United States viewed us as Latinos, Latinas, Latinx. And that was a very different experience. And so I'm also new to Northwest Pennsylvania. Myself and Dr. Lorenzo de la Pena, we came at the same time last year, moved up here to Northwest Pennsylvania. And it has been quite a welcome change in some aspects, and then some portions have been a bit of growing pain. So there's parts of my family, my cultura, that I definitely miss, but I'm happy to connect with others, through this panel, through this opportunity for learning and growing from one another, so that we can share some of our cultural similarities.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if you could see this, but the chat is blowing up with other people who've had the similar experience to you, where their parents pretend not to speak English just so they can learn and grow in the Spanish culture, which I think is amazing. I personally did not grow up in a family where that was supported. So I don't know, I'm not a fluent Spanish speaker. I have a minor in Spanish, so I hope to be one day to express that culture, but it blows my mind. I think it's such a beautiful thing to be bilingual and to have such grounded roots in your culture. So with that note, moving forward, I want to kind of change the discussion a little bit, and I want to kind of discuss the contention around the words Hispanic or Latinx. Those words are kind of thrown around a lot in our culture and in media and different things. And if anybody wants to speak upon why there might be contention there, or your experiences with the terms, in that area.
Well, I think that we can start discussing and unpacking that by understanding that historically the term Hispanic was imposed in the United States on a group of people that, would not nicely fit into a white American description, and whatever that could mean, right? And that has layers of many impacts with race and heritage and ancestry and identities. But the label Hispanic was imposed by the U.S. government system for the census purposes, right? And so this idea of identifying as Hispanic is very much entrenched, at least in my experience, within a very traditional context of being brought up, and that word has a lot of implications in what I've experienced in my life. So for example, my parents, who are Cuban and Puerto Rican, US citizens, have always identified as Hispanic. They do not identify as Caribeños or Caribbean. They identify predominantly as Hispanic American. And they feel very strongly about this because to them, that is a very politicized term, strategically used drenched in American pride and American heritage within the US context, right? And in connection with Puerto Rico and Cuba. Whereas I, as a offspring and this hyphenated generation of Hispanic Latina, identify as Latinx, and I do that intentionally because of the Latino Latinx movement that came out of the 1990s in the United States, where I feel that not only my Spanish Hispanic roots are to be recognized within my heritage and identity, but also my African and Taino and Lebanese, Cuban, Puerto Rican hyphenated roots also are just as strong as the Spanish blood that might run through my veins and my name. So that's my positionality of using the term Latina and Latinx in self-identifying, because I want to make a very intentional and explicit connection to all of my ancestries and heritage and roots. And this didn't come about until later on in life, when I began to understand my position within these different historical narratives as a woman and a woman of color in the United States. Because, we also need to be cognizant that Latina and Latinx in Puerto Rico and in Cuba means something different, or can mean something different, because of the historical context in those island countries. So that's another that we, as Americans in US context, we can't assume that the language we use to self-identify and label each other here in the United States is a globalized language either. So that's a little bit of how I position myself within these very large intersection labels. And I think that there's a lot of complications to this, because as you pointed out, Julianna, where Spanish might not be a language that you strongly identify with or maybe feel even fluent in, you still have connections to Latinx culture in other ways that might not be only in the language. And so what does that mean for identities and for identity building? In the context where we grew up in, right? I have been born and raised in, Northeast United States. So my context and ideas of community in Latinx and Hispanic cultures are going to differ from, Stephanie and Sheila's experiences, right? From Miami. And that's also a different type of border crossing, right? That we're doing, that I'm performing all the time, whether intentionally or not. And when I go to Puerto Rico, when I go to Cuba, the ways that I am seen in those contexts differ from the ways that I am seen in Erie, Pennsylvania, right? And so it complicates these conversations a lot.
Absolutely. I think that was the way you put that was very sophisticated, and you not only were looking on in your life, but what does this mean for the rest of the world, and how does the rest of the world see these terms? So thank you for that and speaking on your experience with these terms, because it helps people like me understand and identify, well, where do I fit into this world as a younger individual? So if anybody else would like to speak on this subject about the contention around these two words, please go ahead. I'm excited to hear your response.
Yeah, I will gladly say some words about that. Thank you, Leslie, for sharing all that information with us today. For me, when someone asks me, what do you consider yourself? That's a question since very early age was problematic, right? Because I grew up in an Argentinian family in Venezuela. So I'm a little bit, this is personal. I don't want to go talk about from the academic point of view. I'm going to talk about from my personal point of view. I always feel like any label is limiting myself. It's telling me you have to be in a certain way. However, I understand like the difference between a term like Hispanic that was imposed by an Anglo world, like by the census, in the 70s by the Nixon government, and then in the 80s in the census, like it's imposed to Latinos, a Latino that it was at least our name that we created, right? A group. So I think that's better. And I think we create labels that are more and more inclusive, like now Latinx, put the X at the end, that is including all the LGBTQ community. So I think that's a good advance in terms, but I still personally feel labels I don't feel comfortable with any label, because if I have to talk about who I am, I will take the whole hour and maybe a whole book or more time, which I won't do it, I promise. But it's a very complicated and difficult world. And I think the less we limit ourselves, saying you have to be in this way, if you're a Latino, is the best. We are, how we connect with each other in the human level is what is important, and then each person could find their own way. Now, politically, I think it's very important that we name ourselves as a group in the United States, right? And we have the power to say who we are. But part of having that power is I don't want to put myself on the one label only. It's sad.
Sorry, I was trying to read this chat down here. It says, yes, he says, yes, thank you for this conversation. I thought I was the one making it complicated. No. I think it altogether is a very difficult subject to address upon. And I appreciate your experience, Dr. Caula, because I myself find where do I fall in this pendulum? What box do I put myself in? And I feel like that's a thing that as we grow older, we are put into those boxes. And as a community, we need to be more open. And I agree with what you were saying, Dr. Caula.
I kind of want to jump in a little bit if possible, even though I have to move somewhere else later.
Absolutely.
I'm getting feedback from somebody. And I have to jump to another meeting soon, so I was trying not to intervene. But when it comes to identity, for people like my road here was different. I left Venezuela. I left my home country, the country that I grew up in, for many different reasons, simply does not exist. There is a piece of land and there is people living there, but it has been so destroyed and transformed that it's not. I don't recognize it anymore. I grew up in a land that I love, but it's simply not there, the country I grew up in. So I feel like I don't have a country now. I don't have a home country. But I'm living in the United States. It's also my country. But when I travel through Latin America, everywhere, Mexico, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Colombia, I have not been to Cuba, I feel at home. There is a connection, an emotional connection, a cultural connection, food, religion, language, jokes, music, the way that the people saw Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, all of the Caribbean, is now my home country. Do we need to use labels and squares? I am not sure. Definitely, I do need to identify myself as part of this larger community, but the borders are really blurry. There is no specific strong border that I'm this or that or X or Y or Z. I know that I have a connection with everybody from Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia. That I remember when I moved to the United States, all by myself, no friends, not speaking the language. Immediately, in a matter of months, I had friends, close friends, from Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, that became my family. So there is a connection, and just the borders are very blurry. That's my take.
Yes, I agree. Dr. Solano, is how that can become very difficult, especially being in America, because we are such a huge melting pot coming from so many different backgrounds and so many different stories and cultures. But there is that identifying key factor that holds us together, is the culture within us. So the next thing I kind of want to talk about is, like, after talking about the Latinx, Hispanic, where do most of you find yourself identifying yourself? I know Leslie touched about this a little bit, how she identifies as Latinx, Latina, but for others, where do you find yourself identifying when somebody asks you, where do you fall on that pendulum?
I can speak a little bit to this. So just to go back on the previous discussion point as well, with the contentions around the term Hispanic and Latinx, recently, and I think I shared this with some of you, there's a very timely poll that just came out from the Pew Research Center that does very nice statistical work on usually providing a nationally representative sample. And they asked US Latinos, Latinas, Latinx about the term Latinx. And in their large sample, about 3,000 individuals, they found that 76% of them had not heard of the term Latinx. 20% of them chose to not use Latinx, and only 3% use Latinx. And so, as Dr. Sotomayor highlighted, how some of this work has been around as far as the development and the understanding of the terminology Latinx to be more gender neutral and inclusive. It's been around, right, for over a decade, but we're still not really familiar with it. It's not coming out in the community, and there's some parts of the United States that are more aware of it than others. And as far as what's being used also in other countries, so in South America, they don't utilize really the word Latinx. This is really a US-centric term that was developed by researchers and by those who have Latinx heritage here in the US. But in South America, they're starting to maybe experiment with the terminology Latin, because Latinx really is an anglicized version of Spanish. It doesn't make sense in Spanish. So Latin is the word that they're really using. So now we have, again, a community in which we feel a part of, right, as either Hispanic or Latinos, Latinas, Latinx. We have a identity that was imposed upon us by the government, and here we are trying to popularize a term Latinx, which is, again, US-centric. So I think that within itself, it poses some dynamics and some complications. But I personally identify as Latina, as Latinx. And I had a conversation with my mother-in-law, who also has various intersectionalities. She is from the Dominican Republic, and she hadn't heard of the term Latinx. So when I shared with her the work that we're doing this month in celebrating Latinx Heritage Month, she said, well, why the Latinx? So I explained to her about it being a more gender neutral and inclusive term that's used to really highlight and showcase marginalized and oppressed communities that are not just part of the Latino, Latina community, but also part of the LGBTQ plus community within that. And she identifies as part of that community and had no idea about it. So she was really happy to hear that and said, well, that's good. We're being progressive, we're moving forward with this. I said, yes, exactly. And then I had a conversation with my mother earlier about the term. And she said, my mother wasn't really asked to identify as Hispanic or Latina until she came to the United States. And so for her, she's always said Hispanic, but thinking about it, she goes, that's not a term. That's not anything that we use. We don't use in Spanish to describe ourselves as Hispanic. So again, through her lived experience, through her life in the US, she had grown to believe that this was the category in which she identified herself, even though truly she, through discussion, found out, really I'm a Latina. I'm part of Latin America. So yeah, that's just a little bit of my reflections and some stats I wanted to share.
Yes, thank you. That was very insightful, and definitely the different aspects from different generations coming together is great as well. Does anybody else want to speak on how do you identify yourself during this climate and the contention between these two words?
I can share. So my name is Tatyana, and I am Puerto Rican and African American. So I identify as an Afro-Latinx. And for me, it's important to identify both cultures from where I'm from, and just realizing that, growing up, I didn't identify, I identified as Latina because I was born and raised with my Hispanic family. But as I got older, I started to learn more about my African American culture and being around more people. So I started to now accept that other part of me, and that is why I identify as Afro-Latinx.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and it makes an impact, and it's who you are as a person, and it's amazing. So my family is part Japanese and Mexican, so we have to kind of configure some way of how I would consider myself. So I understand I come face to face with intersecting racial groups and identities as well. So that's great. Does anybody else want to speak on that? On how you identify yourself?
We have one panelist who's been a little quiet, not to call them out, but if they would like to share anything we talked about.
I'm assuming you mean me.
Well, no, but yes.
Okay. Well,
I was talking about our Latino student organization president.
True. He hasn't. All right, I'll make mine brief. This is still something I'm juggling with and working through myself, personally. So that's why I don't jump out there. It's something that growing up, because we moved, we immigrated here from Cuba, and we had a little bit of an extended travel period. I kind of looked to my parents also to kind of tell me, what am I supposed to identify as? And because they were dealing with everything, and then I'm in the middle, my sister was in the middle of, are we, we grew up in Cuba till we were 9 or 10, and then we came here, and so we're straddling this change. We just kind of went with whatever we were told. So Hispanic was very much the one that was we were told this is what you are now. And it took many years for me to even start to think that we could be something else too, and that was okay. And so when I saw the term Latinx, I really, really liked it for myself. I'm not saying for anybody else. I think though it is a little bit we're trying to still group everybody into it. So in the chat, I kind of posted, I think it's important to have discussions versus trying to grab onto one title and one identifying, word, and instead try to create a conversation or a space for conversation, because I have been at the receiving end of, what are you? And that's, at first, I was really shocked and kind of hurt by that question. But then being able to go like, well, many things, like where are you coming from and what kind of answer are you looking for? Do you want to know where I was born? Do you want to know where I've lived most of my life? Do you want to know what language I speak? What do I do for a living? Like, to me, the question expands it to much more than just this one word answer. And so I think it isn't a short answer, but so Latinx is what I identify with now.
Yes, thank you, Sheila, for giving that experience, because I have been confronted with the "what are you?" and it's like, well, I'm human. Like, what else would you like from me? Because especially in places like northeastern Pennsylvania, where the diversity of Latino Hispanic heritage is so little, people often question, well, you have to be from somewhere, not here. And it's very confusing to somebody who's trying to figure out their identity and where they belong and where they identify. So thank you for sharing that, because I've had very similar experiences to you as well. So this kind of brings up the question is, has others assigned anybody a label without asking you before? Has this been an experience that you want to share, is like, oh, well, you must be this, before they even asked you? Because I feel like I've definitely been in that boat before as well. So if anybody wants to speak on that scenario and how you responded to it, would be great.
I'd like to talk on this topic. So I have, well, bringing in some of what we were talking about before, I identify as Hispano or Hispanic, but I also use it interchangeably with Latinx and Latino. It's not something that I talk about a lot. I'm not sure if it's because I was raised here and I wasn't really taught in school like the differences and just like the lack of information, but I use them interchangeably. And the word Latinx is very powerful in the sense that like it is inclusive towards everyone. And I think the reasoning behind why it's not as recognized and well known across all of the cultures and in the US is because of how hard-headed a lot of Hispanic, Latinx, Latinos, Latinas are with change and integration of like new things. And then to talk about, what was the question again? Sorry, I was literally just focusing on the last one from before.
You're absolutely fine.
I think, did you mention like asking, like someone just assuming what you are?
Yeah, like have you ever been assigned a label before being asked?
So yeah, on that topic, I have been someone just assumed that I am Mexican, which is fine. I am Mexican, but I've been told that I look Asian, Puerto Riqueño, a lot of things, and then sometimes they don't even assume that I am Latino or Hispanic, Latinx. So it really bothers me sometimes because it's a simple question if someone wants to know, but also I know that for some people, if they're assumed a different, like if you're not Mexican, say, and they assume that you're, I don't even know what I'm saying, hold up. Let's say you are Mexican and someone says that you're Puerto Rican and they didn't ask. I know some people can get offended by that. And it's not just that, it's not because like, they don't like Puerto Ricans or something. It's mainly because that's not who they are and you didn't give them the opportunity to express who they are. So I have fallen in that boat.
Yes, thank you so much for explaining that. And in the chat, Sheila explains being labeled as other, or I've been told, she's been told that you're not white, you're something else, or you must be some Lebanese, or I've experienced this in the language I speak. People walk into, I work at a Mexican restaurant and look at me and it's like, hola, tres people. Like, I speak English, I am an American, I live in this country. And so it's very, very, like, people just, like, off the bat just assume that, you know, that you must fall into that category. So you must be that person because you look this way. And And it is, I know exactly what you're talking about. I have friends that from different countries that are like, oh, well, you're Mexican because you're Hispanic looking or Latino looking. Like, no, you didn't ask, you just associated me with something of your image of what I'm supposed to look like. And so that can be very kind of disintegrating to one's identity in some ways. There's a little bit of a chat going on up here, and there's Vicky says that she's Mexican American, but people have always assumed her to be Indian or Jewish or Native or other identities before she's been called exotic on occasions. And Leslie explained that that she's been called a foreigner in all types of cultural identities. And Stephanie kind of chimed in and said, yes, being raised in the US, we are not taught about Hispanic and Latinx heritage in schools. And this adds to the layers of complications when we begin to explore our identities. Unless we seek the knowledge ourselves, we would not know. It is not passed down to us by our family like other heritage cultures, customs, and stories are. I'm sorry if I butcher this. Lorenzo says, I have been asked right after an introduction, what's the best Mexican restaurant? And Valeria says, I have never been correctly identified as an Argentina. So it's interesting. Now living in Argentina, no one assumes I'm anything other than Argentine. It's a weird life shift. So all of these things just go to prove that we are also like the Latinx Hispanic community is so broad and so amazing and gorgeous and diverse, and we all have different stories and different cultures, and we all compile into this group of people that makes the most amazing culture and stories. So I think I can relate to a lot of these comments that people are making, just being an American, growing up, trying to understand my identity throughout this whole process. So does anybody else have anything to share on others assigning labels or situations where you've been confronted with this issue?
Yes, I do. I think everything is related to where you are too. I used to live in the suburbs of Pittsburgh for years, and I felt like there I was identified more as a Mexican as soon as people hear my accent, because they were not used to, at least 12 years ago. I think things are changing. So they just ask me questions like they say in the chat. Do you know a good Mexican restaurant? It's like, no, I'm not Mexican, right? Which I love Mexico, right? I love the Mexican culture, but that's not who I am, right? So it's just that assuming the stereotype that you are Mexican or Puerto Rican because are the most common immigrants in the United States. But I live in Pittsburgh now, and I feel like people get less weird with my accent or are more open to the accent or the different culture, assume less. So I think it has a lot to do with your context, where you are, in a city or in the suburbs, and what part of the country. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. I definitely do think it has to do with location as well. So I grew up in Colorado, and the Hispanic Latino community is humongous compared to out here. So I've never in my life had felt different until I moved to Pittsburgh, because I looked like everybody else. The culture was the same. Everybody was speaking Spanish. We all made enchiladas for dinner on a random Tuesday night. Not saying that every family does, but when you move to a place where this culture is not as prominent, it becomes evident. And I've never walked into a class and had one of my peers say to me, "Oh, you look like me," before, because she has had that experience of growing up in a community where that's not. And I was the first person that she had seen in so long that resembled that culture. And so that's very interesting to me. So I'm going to read a little bit more of these comments where Sheila explains when she visited her hometown in Cuba, she was seen as a white gringa because she wasn't dark as everyone until she spoke Spanish. So it can happen anywhere, which is such a great point too, as well as like this can happen. In some communities, you're not Hispanic enough or Latino enough, and then some communities, oh, you're too much. And it's like, there's this like balance of like, okay, well, I just want to be me. Like, I just want to be human. I just want to identify with who I am, celebrate the cultures of who I am. And I think that's why it's so important that we have discussions like this, to open up those barriers of we are just who we are and we're beautiful for who we are.
Julianna, we had a question come in on Facebook, if I could interject real quick. The question is, when talking about identity, what is the most ideal way to ask, particularly when working with children and young adults? How do we teach them how to appropriately ask questions regarding identity?
That's such a good question. I think the way not to do it is to ask, what are you? Because I personally get offended when people are, what are you? So some of these,
You could ask other panel members to answer the question too.
Sorry, I was trying to read the chat and try to interject and.
No, you're doing great. I just wanted to open it up.
Yes, absolutely. Anybody, go ahead, take that question and run with it.
I think that the premise that Sheila brings up about it even happening in Cuba, and that's been my experience as well in Puerto Rico and Cuba, the way that I am seen on those islands is very different from the way that I'm seen here on the mainland in the US. And, you know, not to be that person, but I'm going to be that person to kind of label the elephant in the room about what these discussions are encircling. It's racism. I mean, that's what we're talking about. It's racist histories and language that has been embedded into, you know, so many aspects of our identities, and they get passed down. So, you know, when someone, you know, and this is my personal view on it, of course, but you know, in my experience, when someone asks you where you're from, insinuating that you're not from wherever you're standing, it's kind of a racist question. I mean, I don't think there's any way around that, you know? And, you know, is there a polite way to ask that so it doesn't sound as racist? I don't think so, personally. I think that we need to change the language that we're using. I think that we all need to acknowledge and be aware that the United States is a mosaic of different cultures and heritage and ancestries, languages, and skin tones. And, you know, once we can even begin to acknowledge that, then maybe we can see that we're all from somewhere and that the language we use to talk about our heritage and culture should not be hyphenated, you know, with racist ideology. But I have a lot of thoughts on that point, but I know we're almost out of time, so.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, I just don't like that question, don't feel comfortable. Maybe because I've been asked that question in ways that are not very, I remember once ordering coffee in a Starbucks, and the lady that took my order told me, wow, I love your accent, really nice at the beginning. And suddenly she said, are you planning to stay here? And I was like, well, I am American. Of course I'm planning to stay here. And I feel really uncomfortable. Like, I have many experiences like that. And I don't think we should make someone feel different just because of where they come from. Doesn't matter. That's not the way to connect. It's, again, put a label on someone. Right. Even though I completely agree with the term Latinx is a more inclusive now. And if I have to identify with one, I would do that one. I prefer not to use labels or be judged for where I am from, only and respected as a human with a bunch of cultures that I, that I have in me, and that they're a part of me. Yes.
I would like to chime in. So I would agree, like it's not appropriate to just ask someone where they're from. I think getting to know someone and taking the time to get to know them, and then when it's appropriate, asking a person like their ethnicity, and then getting to know them first before you're asking these questions, because you don't want to just come out and like, what is your ethnicity? But I think that would be a more appropriate way. Just take the time to get to know people and understanding who they are before you're just asking them where they're from and what their background is.
I absolutely agree with you, Tatyana. I think maybe an appropriate question to be like, oh, where's your family heritage from? But I think that is kind of a line or a border that you kind of have to get to know the person before you're like, oh, well, your heritage has to be from somewhere, not here. Well, what is here? So very well said, Tatyana.
I'd like to chime in as well.
Absolutely.
So I agree a lot with what you said, Leslie, Dr. Sotomayor. And a lot of it is learned, right? So I want to share a little bit about my personal experience and then some thoughts on what you said and when it's appropriate to ask someone how they identify, or the most PC way of saying it, I guess. So when I was about 9 years old, I went to visit some family in Argentina, and they introduced me to a friend of the family's, and she asked, oh, you're visiting, where are you visiting from? And I said, oh, I'm visiting from America. And she looked at me stone cold and said, but you're in America. You're in South America. And I didn't know at the time because I was 8 years old, but I felt embarrassed by that response and immediately turned red. And I was like, oh, it's like, yeah, you live in North America in the United States, but this is South America. And her response was a historical one, right? It was pointing out the US-centric ideologies that I had been taught in school. I was taught to believe that because I'm from the US, I'm superior. And so I'm American, and this is America, when really we have North America, Central America, South America. So with that in consideration, right, it was how I identified myself being a young child. And now growing up, I see and learning more and more about this every day, of course, with time, I see how history has purposely erased some of the Latinx and Hispanic heritage and influence that took part in the founding of this country, how they don't teach it in schools, and how they really do focus again on a Eurocentric, upbringing and creation of this country. And through that, we're taught to be, in a sense, right, to really look at the US and at race, at being white, as being superior. And so asking someone how to identify, it can certainly, and just thinking it's okay to do that in a casual conversation, right when you meet someone, or as Dr. Caula said, someone commenting on your accent, like as if she was complimenting your purse. I love your accent, right? Like, I love your purse. It's more personal than that. And a lot of it does come from ignorance. People are taught this in the United States, and depending upon what region you grew up in, what area you grew up in, that varies as well. So I'm a strong proponent of education can help to undo some of that learned behavior, but calling it like it is and having people really see the true meaning behind the behavior, how it makes one feel when they're experiencing it as part of it as well. And another issue that comes within our own community is, I know time is wrapping up now, but another issue that comes in our own community, and Sheila touched on this, is when you travel to your own country. So when I go to Argentina, or if I've been to other countries and I speak Spanish, people assume that I'm not going to speak Spanish well, or I don't understand Spanish because of the color of my skin. So in Miami, I was known as passing because I have fairer skin. So no one ever saw me as a Latina. And growing up, I would be often oppressed from the Latino community because I wasn't Latina enough, right? I wasn't dark-skinned enough. And when I would come to the US, others would see me and immediately say, oh, you're Mexican, right? I was labeled as Mexican several times traveling through Georgia and Louisiana, and the South has a very strong history when it comes to, race and racism as well. But those were a lot of my experiences there as well. So not only do we have the complication of identifying as other, right, and putting ourselves into a box when it comes to being in the US, but we also within our own community, within our own history, have colorism and how that impacts the Latino, Latina, Latinx communities as well. So I just wanted to bring some light to that.
If I don't mind, I want to say something very quickly. I think we're short in time, but I think something that as being a Latina or Latinx in the United States, difficult or specific of this experience is like when I go back to Latin America, and I see it more with my daughter that was born here. And when I go with her to Venezuela or Argentina, she's considered like from the United States, even though she has all the heritage. And for me too, so it's like we lose our place. We are here in a lower status than a white American, but when we go back to our countries, we don't belong there anymore. So it's like an intersection. We're in a middle point that I'm so glad we are like now trying to get a place, understand our identity, doing more research on that, because I think it's very important, that topic of identity, to empower ourselves, to embrace our cultures and all that we are. So I just wanted to notice that middle point, I think was Sheila, the one that said that when she goes back to Cuba, she's treating us as like she's from the United States, correct? I was going to say American, not anymore, because it's true, America is the whole continent. But that's an important topic, that we are in intersection between two worlds.
Can I add something to that? I know we're also short in time, but for me, I was born here in the United States. So there's always been a battle when I go to Mexico where it's, am I Mexican enough? Because people don't look at me as a Mexican because I was born in the United States. Or when I come back, am I American? And I mean, United States, like American enough to be here? Like there's no, like it's a battle between both. So to me, like that reminds me of, I don't know if you guys remember Selena Quintanilla. She would always say the same thing where she doesn't know if she's Mexican enough or American enough. So I think it's funny, or like a coincidence, that even in other places like Cuba, in Puerto Rico and all them places, it's kind of the same, where if you go back to your mainland, it's kind of the same where you get criticized because you were born in America or United States.
If I could quickly circle back around to the question about how to talk to children about, about culture and about being different. I recently had an experience in a class where somebody shared their own story, but I want to move back and kind of come at this from the angle of a parent of two young children. And the story told in class made me kind of realize that at some point, if I haven't already, which I'm sure I have, but I will be put in the spot where my children are going to ask someone that looks different than them something that's going to embarrass me, because it's not going to be language I'm going to want them to use. And it's making me kind of consider like the importance of not chastising my children at a very young age to ask their own questions and to explore, those difficult lines, those different boundaries themselves, and get the answers that they want, or the answers to things that they're wondering about. Like maybe they'll want to touch somebody's hair. Maybe they'll want to, touch somebody's skin, or ask like, why is it a different color than theirs? And I don't want to impose my thoughts or even my experiences onto my kids by giving them the answer that the other person needs to give them. And so that's, I guess, my 2 cents from I'm still trying to figure this out. They're very little, but I'm sure somebody else will have a different answer to that.
I would say, like, I don't get offended if a child comes up to me and like asks questions like regarding like my hair, or like if I'm speaking Spanish or something. But I do think that it is the parent's responsibility to then educate their child after, so that it doesn't happen again, like when they're older. So I do think it's a learning experience. Allow them to ask those questions and get the answers that are given to them, but also then coming back and talking to them and like, okay, this person responded this way, but you may not always get that type of response from someone. And like just having them understand like why it's okay or why it's not okay.
Great points, everyone. I still don't know, after months of Zoom, like how much is the right amount of time to, how much is the right amount of time until like you interject, right? Because like in face-to-face, it's different. Like, you know, when it's time, it's your cue to talk, but when it's on Zoom, I'm like, did I wait enough time to talk? I don't know. So if anyone else wants to add to the conversation, please do. But I think that we've gone over time, and there's just so much more that we can keep this conversation going. I think we do plan on doing that. But I just again want to thank everyone on the panel for their participation, and thank all of you who have come today and engaged in this brave space with us and engaged in this conversation. And yes, we do plan on continuing this, and we'll keep you informed.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
We didn't talk about food. We forgot the food, the best part.
Oh, of course, food, yes.
We'll have to do it. We'll have to do an entire episode next time just of food. So we'll promise that for our viewers.
2 hours.
I heard arepas and I can't stop thinking about them.
Thank you. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. The live stream is stopped. I will let everybody know when we have the video finished. So I appreciate everybody and your participation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Terrence, for your comments, for being part of this too.
I'm sorry.